for the same quantity and quality of service, you can reduce the cost of making that provision by roughly 50% by doing it in the private sector. Now, think of it this way. Think of the biggest privatizations we've had in the history of man. China, Deng, December 1979. They started moving into privatization, and look what's happened to China. I mean, all of a sudden, it's exploded.
The government has reportedly drawn up emergency plans to renationalise Thames Water after mounting debt and financial woes led to the resignation of their CEO. The embattled company may have secured some financing for now, but there continue to be demands for a state takeover of the sector, and often driven by questions not just about the financial sustainability, but also around sewage and other pollution-related issues in the water industry. Welcome back to the IEA podcast. I'm Matthew Lesh, the Director of Public Policy and Communications here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question to a top thinker. Today's question is, should water be renationalised? To discuss, I'm very excited to be joined by Professor Steve Hanke. He's an economist at Johns Hopkins University, as well as a member of the IEA's Academic Advisory Council. Steve has not only got a recent letter on this topic in the Financial Times, but has been writing and advising about water research management since the 1960s. He's also advised President Ronald Reagan on privatization, and separately to that, he's the author of an IEA publication on lockdowns that recently released, so that won't be the topic today. Steve, welcome to the podcast. I was wondering if I haven't really done full justice to your background in this field. If you wanted to talk us through your history of researching and writing about water and resources.
Okay, so Matthew, it's great to be with you at the IEA, of course. My work, actually original research work, was back in the 1960s. That's when I started working on water resource problems. And the initial work that I did was all related to the demand for water, measuring the demand for water. And I did the first study that was ever done on the effects of the installation of water meters on water consumption. And at the time, that was a big deal because there was more or less an international debate, including in the UK, about the efficacy of installation of water meters. And my research found it was the first study that looked at the impact, that kind of the price elasticity, if you will, of the water installation and moving from what would be without meters as zero marginal price per unit of water consumed to a positive price with meter installation. And I found that, and it didn't surprise me, but it surprised a lot of engineers, and that is that the price elasticity was very high. If you give somebody something free, they use a lot of it, waste a lot of it, and so on. If the price is zero, if the price is positive, they conserve and take care of things. So that was the finding in that study. Now that water meter study comes back to my first contact with Thames Water. Of course, it was nationalized then. This was in the early 1970s. And one of the board members of Thames was availed of my research. We got to know each other. I started advising him. And of course, the fight was with the engineers at Thames, because the engineers, and almost all the British engineers, by the way, at the time, said water meters were for the birds. They were a waste of money because they cost a lot. You had to read the meters. In those days, you had to have a meter man going around every month putting the recording in of how much water was being used. They didn't have electronic remote meter reading and all that kind of stuff.
So Steve, I'll say, as someone who moved to the UK from Australia, I was actually shocked by the fact that my water is not metered. And I'm a customer of Thames Water, whose water is still not metered. And I can tell you, it certainly does change the way you think about the amount of water you're going to use. The limiting factor, of course, is the cost of heating the water is quite substantial. The cost of the gas.
Absolutely. So that was the start. Then I did a lot of other work, really pioneering work, also like the water metering thing on the price elasticity and income elasticities associated with water use. And by the way, a lot of that work was done also in the early 70s in Australia. I spent a lot of time in Adelaide and Perth doing these kinds of studies. And there, the big thing was tying in the demand for water with the pricing of water. And my arguments were in Australia that seasonal pricing would be appropriate because of, the hot summer months when water is scarce and the marginal cost of water is high. You want to have a relatively high price. So all of those things kind of work together. So demand for water, and that's associated with the price that you're charging for water.
Yeah.
And whether water restrictions, for example, sometimes in some places they have administered mandates and restrictions on water use. You can only water your yard every other day or something.
That. Steve, I grew up in a drought full of water restrictions due to probably an unwillingness to price it properly.
I was measuring all those things. So that was the first phase. The second phase was the costing of water, and that leads to, of course, the price that you're charging. You have to be able to figure out the marginal cost of each gallon or meter of water that you're using, and then if you figure out that marginal cost, that ideally you want to set the price there. So that work was demand cost side. And then I also did a lot of work in benefit cost analysis where you're looking at, do I invest in another reservoir in the system, or should I be building an irrigation system? Or should I build a hydro plant? And that's the investment side. So we have demand, supply, investment. And then with you mentioned Reagan. With Reagan, I was the privatization czar. Most of that work was privatizing public lands in the United States, which cover a vast area, about 6 times larger than the surface area of France is covered by public land in the United States. So that was my main thing. But I also was a big advocate of privatizing water utilities because it happened to be something I knew something about. And so that's the story there. In fact, the first article that I wrote about privatizing water in the United States was in 1981. I was at the President's Council of Economic Advisors and wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the French system of franchising and private provision of water. So that's that in a nutshell. That's the background.
Yeah, there's for those more interested in your extensive work, there's an extensive bibliography of various articles. Why don't we move on to that privatization in general, and then we'll move on to the specific UK case and issues. I mean, so you're a long-term advocate for water privatization. That's something that's very much criticised, and if you believe the polls, is very unpopular in the UK at the moment. I'm wondering what the general case is for taking water out of public hands and giving it to private operators.
Okay, the general case, let's go back to The Wealth of Nations and Adam Smith. If you read Smith carefully, Smith noted that most of Europe, and including, of course, the UK, was covered by public lands, crown lands. And he studied this and said that the crown lands were only about 25% as productive as comparable private lands. So you have a huge increase by privatization of any resource. Smith was talking about land, but we do find out, if we look at the empirical work, there's something called the bureaucratic rule of 2. if you want to figure out the cost of doing anything, you in the public sector, all you have to do is make a calculation of the private cost, which you can find because our private companies have to keep accounts, and you can figure out how much it's costing. That's not the case in the public sector. So you want to estimate how much is it going to cost if I transfer something out of the private sector and put it in the public domain for public management. And the bureaucratic rule of two is you figure out the private cost and multiply it by 2. So, by the way, that's roughly consistent with what Adam Smith has in The Wealth of Nations, 1776. So all the econometric work leads to that conclusion. You end up with, for the same quantity and quality of service, you can reduce the cost of making that provision by roughly 50% by doing it in the private sector. Now, think of it this way. Think of the biggest privatizations we've had in the history of man. China, Deng, December 1979. They started moving into privatization, and look what's happened to China. I mean, all of a sudden it's exploded. Think of Russia and land, the privatization of land in Russia. Russia was, in the late 1980s, they were a big importer of grain. They couldn't produce enough grain to meet their own minimal consumption needs at the time. They were importers. Now they're the biggest exporter of wheat in the world. Because of what? Privatization. So if you, and now we get into, let's go to the micro kind of thing with water. Let's talk about water.
Yeah, I think this is important because the general concern is, even some free marketeers, of course, privately owned resources are going to be more efficiently used. But of course, water provision is generally understood to be, probably the classic case of a natural monopoly. There can only really be efficiently, potentially one provider of water to your home. And therefore, you're giving someone effective market power if you do privatize water provision. And therefore, that potentially leads to issues, including some of the issues that the UK is currently facing.
Okay, so broadly speaking, since 1990, let's see what is the trend. The trend is towards privatization. It's happening all over the world. And in 1999, about 5% of the world's population was provided with water by private provision. That now is about 20%. So there's been a huge expansion in the private provision of water. And among other things, interestingly enough, the World Bank in developing countries, many times they mandate that they'll make a loan for water provision, but it has to be provided privately. And so then you get into the question that you raised. Well, isn't water a so-called a monopoly, a public monopoly? And that's what they call a natural monopoly. And it is, but you can make that a privately provided service, even though you don't want, it's a natural monopoly. Why? You don't want a multiple of water pipes going through, 20 different water pipes competing with each other to provide service for somebody. It's much more efficient to have one provider. So the question is, how do you make that competitive? And actually, Edwin Chadwick, a great public health man, UK, 19th century, who did a lot of interesting work and really microeconomics, Chadwick. And one thing that he did is introduce the idea of competition for natural, and where you had a natural monopoly, let's say a gas company or water company, electricity, that kind of thing. So what do? you have competition for the field. You have a franchise for the right to serve an area. And how do you do the bidding for the franchise? How do you competitively get that bid out so that you get the right provision and that efficiency? You specify the franchise bidding in such a way that they're bidding for who's going to provide a given quantity and quality of service at the lowest price. So the bidder isn't bidding for the highest price for the franchise to get it that way. It's not like going to Sotheby's and making a bid for an art object where the highest bidder gets the thing. No, it's the one who's going to provide the specified quantity and quality of service at the lowest price. So that was Chadwick. As it turns out, the French had already been doing this for some time, franchise bidding. And the French remain the leaders in franchise bidding for all kinds of public services, but water in particular. Water service is provided primarily by private provision in France through franchises.
And yeah, of course, that's very interesting on the franchising point. I'm wondering how that compares to the UK's model of water privatization. How did the UK go about privatizing water in a different way to that French style franchising?
Okay, let's get the franchise. The franchise, the key thing is to specify exactly what the private entity is bidding for to obtain a franchise. And there are different kinds of franchises, by the way. In France, there's something called a concession. And in that case, you bid for the right to own, to have a concession and manage the entire water system and be responsible for investments in the infrastructure, upgrading it, quality of service, the pricing, and all of everything. Then they have other types in which the public engages and is responsible for investing in the infrastructure of the system, and the private water company just manages the system. And then they have all kinds of mixes in between. So the specification of the contract is absolutely critical. It has to be extremely detailed. And
would you say, Steve, it has to be watertight?
Absolutely, Matthew. Watertight is the right phrase. And if the terms of the contract are not met, there have to be stiff penalties for non-compliance of the contract and the franchise. Now, the question is, who designs the contract? And who monitors the contract? Who polices the thing? And that's the key. The public has to have an agent to do this. So the agent in France ultimately is the inspector of finance. It is a highly trained, very highly paid, by the way, inspectors of finance. It's the highest and most prestige part of the civil service are inspectors of finance. So there's almost no corruption because these people are paid very high salaries. It's a very prestige job. So they monitor and police the contract, and the contract has been designed by the agents of the public too. And that's how things proceed. Now, in Britain, the privatization was fine. That was a great idea, getting this thing out of the public bureaucracy, because with the public bureaucracy, the public really doesn't have an agency. They have an agency problem, and that's to keep the bureaucrats in line and keep the bureaucrats doing what they should be doing.
And it's probably worth unpacking very quickly here that the UK water system was not in a good nick before privatization. It was massively underinvested into, wasn't particularly efficient, a lot of pollution, a lot of leakage, not particularly well-costed or efficient system. So the system was not idyllic. No, it
was not ideal. And as I indicated before, when I was advising Thames Water, when it was nationalized, it was very backward. I mean, it was compared to the French systems, it archaic. I mean, unbelievable. They didn't even have water meters. That's what I was advising them on. So it was extremely backwards. Then it was privatized. But the agency setup was all wrong. They regulate it with regulators at OFWAT is the regulator, and the idea was that they would regulate the water tariffs and water rates, but in fact that system just is pretty dysfunctional.
So I think the criticism what's happened in UK under privatization is it's probably two main criticisms. One is about the kind of financial management of these privatized companies, that effectively they've used cheap borrowing, low interest rates in order to stack themselves up with debt, take profits out of the company, take that debt out of the company and pay shareholders. That's on the one end of it in terms of their financial management. And then the other end of it, there's this really very big question in UK politics about sewage companies dumping, water companies dumping sewage when there's overflows, and that dirtying rivers and streams and beaches.
Okay, this is the agency. This is the contract. In a good franchise, that can't happen, because they would not be allowed to dump wastewater beyond specification. And if they did, there'd be non-compliance with the contract, and they'd be fined with huge fines if they did that. Number one. And as far as this, this going into debt and raising debt capital and paying it out to shareholders, that would be specified in the franchise. That would not be allowed. These franchises are hundreds of pages long and highly specified contracts. And this idea of regulating the way they do it in Great Britain, it's a typical kind of British screw up, quite frankly. And that is, the regulator, it's a loosey-goosey affair. It's highly primitive. If you saw a franchise contract in France, all the details and everything, it'd blow your mind. They've got everything down to the smallest pump in the system, and when it's going to be replaced, and who's going to replace it, and what at what cost limit, everything. All of this is specified. Everything is in a contract. This is contract law number 101.
So Steve, a few thoughts here. My first thought is to say, in very slight defense of the water companies, which is, I don't think the story is entirely bad about privatization in terms of the real cost to consumers of water in the UK has actually gone down. Where after considering inflation over the last 20 years, there have been some significant investments into the sector. The concerns about sewage are obviously real and genuine, but at the same time, a lot of it's driven by the fact that the sewage dumping has now been counted in a way that wasn't previously counted. So people are just aware of what's going on in a way that they weren't in the past. The water companies will make a defense on the lines of, well, we can fix the sewage problem, but it's going to cost billions and billions. The Ofwat makes the decision about how much we're allowed to charge, and therefore the amount of kind of capital therefore available for investment. And then still, though, there's all these issues. My thought then comes back to, going back to your principal agent problem. Well, it seems like the French law is very dependent on competent bureaucracy, and that's something the UK doesn't seem to be particularly capable of delivering through its regulators. So the UK could give a lot more powers to Ofwat and I suspect will be giving a lot more powers to Ofwat and encouraging them to be far more prescriptive in terms of what they expect from water companies. I'm not sure that's going to lead to particularly better outcomes if they're not competent.
Yeah, you're right. The civil service is a big thing, and there's a long tradition in France of the inspector of finance, and so that and there's a long tradition of franchising, but there's a difference here. There's a basic difference, and that is the franchising system. That by the way, a great Brit was conceptually worked the thing out, Chadwick, and it's competition. Everything is competition. So it is, and that's different than the UK system, which is privatized but regulated. It's regulated, not so it isn't. The idea isn't competition. The idea is regulation. You will have some public body that regulates the thing, and the public body is the agent of the public. So I think the key breakdown that we've had in the UK, as I look at it, is the regime of regulation has been, let's say, not up to standard. That's the key thing.
Yeah, so it's effectively a case of regulatory failure, which has caused the problems with the UK's water system. And you advocated, including in your letter, for the movement towards that franchising system. I'm interested in just unpacking a little bit more there. What the kind of ways in which you consider to be effective accountability, because I noticed in one of your articles writing about this, you discuss not just potentially government regulated, but also in a sense privatizing or outsourcing to a law firm or to a auditing company the insurance that the contract is well designed,
right,
and properly enforced.
So that gets into an interesting. It's all the big problem in this whole area is the agency problem. That is really the nub of the whole thing. Because, by the way, if you look at private provision, one easy way to think about it, the private companies around the world, the leakage in the systems is much less than it is in the public system. So some of these public systems will leak up to 40 or 45% of the water being produced in the system. Now, what if you were running an automobile factory and half of the cars that you produced, you just drove them off a cliff or drove them into the sea? That gives you some idea of the efficiency. By the way, the private companies, many of them are down around 10% leakage. It isn't efficient to go down to zero, but it's efficient to get them down to around 10%. But at any rate,
talking about the principal agent problem here in terms of the way to try to solve it. I mean, just classically also.
Okay. The way to try to solve it, I still think franchising, competitive franchising, is a way to do it. But you now let's say we're in the UK context. You don't have a civil service that's very up to standard, shall we say. Let's say you don't have inspectors of finance like they have in France. So what do? I argue you should use a private agent to monitor and police the private franchise or concession that you have. So you have a private, you privatize the policing and monitoring, basically. Instead of having the civil service do it like they do in France, you have the private sector take care of the thing.
And that therefore helps solve a lot of the issues. One last topic I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on is kind of this essential question that Ofwat has arguably gotten wrong. I'm not 100% certain they've got it wrong. I think it's hard to try to figure out whether or not they've got it wrong. This question about the extent of investment into the system, about whether or not there has been underinvestment by the companies. The first argument for people who want to nationalize it is, well, the reason for that is because of profits. The fact that companies take profits out of the system means that there isn't enough investment. Now, I think your argument would probably be, well, if you're more efficient, then there's room for both more profits and more investment. But how do you work out what should be the specified levels of investment into the system to try to fix some of the issues?
That's all specified in the contracts. That's specified in the franchises. Now some, for very long-lived investment, this can be done in stages where you specify for the next 5 years. This is what they do in France. They specify exactly, for example, not in a concession where they're responsible for everything. They specify everything that must be invested in. But let's say it's a mixed system in France where smaller investment items, not the heavy duty infrastructure, the 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 reservoirs and big transmission pipes and things like that. Those sometimes are taken care of by the municipality in France, but the smaller things like meters, for example, and maintenance and repair and everything, that is done privately, but it's all specified. That's why I say to really regulate these things properly, if you have regulation, all of that has to be written into some sort of contracts, even if you have a regulatory structure like they do in the UK.
So one other issue that's coming up a bit again in the UK, and I think you've also written about, is who should effectively pay for water, and whether or not it should be effectively the richer households who asked to pay some extra amount for their water bills in order to cross-subsidize lower income households in the name of equity. What do you make of those kind of calls? I think that the Thames Water boss has been.
Well, I think generally it's rubbish. You get into lots of problems when you do that. The what you should be doing is calculating what is the marginal cost of water, and you should be setting the price at whatever the marginal cost is, and that's the way to proceed for everybody. Everybody, whether they're rich or poor, if they're using a unit of water, the cost of that water is the same for everybody. It's not discriminating against you because you're rich and me because I'm poor. We're both imposing the same cost on the system, so we should be paying the same price. Now, that the equity, if it's decided publicly that there is an equity problem, everybody should pay the same price, but maybe there's some kind of lump sum payment that's made to poor Joe because his household has 10 kids or something, and his income is very small, or maybe he's disabled, or maybe a veteran or something like that. Maybe there's some other criteria where you have a lump sum payment for water. But,
or just a general welfare, basic
right.
kind of transfer system.
It's part of the welfare system. But as far as the water itself goes, whoever received that lump sum payment in the welfare system would still be paying the same price for water as everybody else. And why? Not only they're imposing the same cost on the system, but you want them managing their water and not wasting it. This is one thing that's very interesting that's going on right now. There is an international movement, and a lot of it's centered at the United Nations, that water is a human right. It should be a free good. Everybody should be receiving water free. Now, how the lefties get on this is beyond me, because most of these same lefties are big environmentalists. And one thing that's bad for the environment is to be not paying anything for water you're using, because what happens if you're not paying for water, you use too much of it. You've got to keep building reservoirs all over the place, taking up open space, damming rivers and streams and so forth to have a reservoir. And the same thing with leakage, by the way. One way to increase the capacity of a water system dramatically is to privatize it, because if you privatize it, the private companies will plug the leaks. So you won't have to build as many reservoirs as rapidly as would otherwise be the case, because you've got leak detection and control is a very high priority with private companies.
Well, Steve, it's been a fascinating conversation. We could keep going. Even the question about reservoirs as well in the UK is quite interesting, because I think there was a particular case where Thames Water did, in fact, try to build a new reservoir, but unfortunately they were blocked by an local council. And then one of the local MPs who opposed the reservoir also opposed the imposition of water restrictions and concerns about water supply. So it turns out you do have to plan and build things, or let people build things when they want to. But I think we might have to leave it there. I think it's been generally a fascinating conversation about the background to water privatization and the different models and methods and how to make it a success as well as not so much in the UK. Thank you so much, Professor Steve Hanke.
My final thought after we've had this conversation, Matthew, is this: you want to go private. That's a no-brainer. It's going to be superior to public. The big issue is how you organize the agency problem to manage and insert competition and discipline into the private sector. And I think the superior way to do that is with competitive franchising like they do in France. But if you have a regulatory structure and that's the agency you want to use, like the UK, then that agency has to be properly organized, properly operating, and by the way, specifying in great detail exactly what the contractual relationships are between the water company and the public that the private company is serving.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Steve Hanke, economist at Johns Hopkins University and a long-running expert on these questions of water privatization. If you are enjoying the IEA podcast, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider. And if you want to learn more about the IEA and our research, just visit iea.org.uk.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.